wanted to share with you is really just some thoughts and the lessons, as I call them, that were new to me and were particularly interesting for me. And if a different person were presenting that, I'm sure they would have focused on some different areas. And since we have such a wealth of knowledge on RCTs here, if I say something that is completely not true, please correct me too, because this is still a new area for me, and I'm still just learning. So, there we go.
Yeah.
So what is a clinical trial? About 2 days in the Institute, I was still trying to figure that out. Because I do a lot of work where we do little experiments. And so a clinical trial, the way it's defined, is the prospective study comparing the effect and value of interventions against control group in human beings. And this is the definition from this book, Fundamentals of Clinical Trials, which, how many of you guys have read that? 1 or 2. Excellent. Really cool book. I highly recommend reading it. It's written from the medical standpoint, so it would give you understanding of how clinical trials are done in the medicine, but it's very applicable to behavioral trials too. And so once I figured out what the clinical trials are, so they're prospective studies, meaning they have to be, you plan it ahead, and you can't just look at what happened to people before. And you compare the effect in your intervention, whatever the intervention might be, to some control group. And I'll talk about how do you actually select the control group, because that was a big, big issue. And here we focus on the human. So this is kind of a very broad definition of what a clinical trial is, and what differentiated this institute from, for example, what was in this book, is that the focus was on behavioral trials. How we all know that there are pills and medicines that can help different conditions, but there's also a lot of research showing that a behavioral intervention might be as effective, if not more effective, for some conditions than a pill. And in other cases, you actually need to change a behavior in order to produce some health outcome. And so the focus is on behavior. So I'll go in terms of different lessons today. So lesson 1, if you're interested in this institute, apply. How did I find out about it? I love summer institutes. And they're NIH, they actually have quite a lot of different ones. And it's extremely useful, and they pay for you to go to like different places, and it really looks really good on your resume. So just Google NIH Summer Institute, find out what it is. And then apply. And all you need to, this is very delayed. The deadline for applications last year was in early February, and all you need to do is to provide a personal statement and a sponsor letter. And in a personal statement, all you need to really show them is how a randomized clinical trial, behavioral one, is fitting in your overall career goals. Is it something that you're working towards? Why do you need to attend this institute? And a sponsor letter from the mentor saying basically how useful this would be for you. Unfortunately, they, at least in the last year, they were saying that they give preference to U.S. nationals, so either citizens or permanent residents, and they had occasionally foreign citizens in the past, but they were either paid for by somebody else or something like that. So they don't outright reject foreign citizens, but they don't accept them. So I would definitely still encourage your foreign citizen to apply.
Is it okay to ask a question?
Oh yes, please. Also throughout, please feel to interrupt me with questions. Yes.
Is it targeted to postdocs and assistant professors, or are folks like associate professors or full professors also eligible?
Excellent question. It is targeted at the lower, so like assistant professors and postdocs. That's their focus target group. They do accept associate professors too, but only, they say, after they kind of satisfied if they don't get enough lower level people, then they would go to associate. But most people, so this summer institute, there were 32 participants, which is higher than the usual number. And probably 2/3 were assistant professors, and the third were postdocs. And they explicitly state that K, it's not a requirement to have a K in order to participate in the institute, and you don't, but you shouldn't also write your K saying, oh, I'm going to go to this institute. So it wouldn't be, which I did actually. In my application for K99, that was one of my training things. I'm like, I'm going to go there. But, and so a lot of people had Ks there already, but a lot of people were just working on their case and as postdocs trying to write their case. Okay. So, first thing, make sure if you're interested, definitely apply. And if you have any questions or about that, I'll be happy to talk more about it. So, lesson 2 is what do we understand as trials? And this is deliberately fuzzy, because what I always thought as clinical trial is something that's, that big clinical trial where you have huge number of participants, multi-million enterprise, and it's the efficacy trial, which I didn't really understand what efficacy was. So the lesson 2 is really you need to see the big picture. And the picture here is from it's called the orbit model, and the citation is on the bottom, and I have the actual paper there, in case you want to look at it. You can feel free. Oops.
Okay.
Sorry. There we go. And so the idea here is figure out where on this big picture you're interested. And your goals should be set on working towards the efficacy trial setting, which is the quintessential clinical trial study. But in order for you to get there, there's many, many steps in the process that you need to fill in before. So the first part is, what is your significant clinical question? What is this burning problem that needs to be solved? Is it a disease that doesn't have a treatment, or a disease that has a treatment but it's so expensive that it cannot be applicable to many countries, or even a lot of people in this country? Is it the mechanisms through which the treatment might work? So whatever is your significant clinical question, that should be your focus. And then you go and do a lot of basic behavioral and social science research to determine kind of what are the effects of this? What can be done to change that? And what I realized a lot of my research and a lot of my studies when we do experiments, when we show little messages to people and we tweak one little tiny thing in the message, like change the color of the person's shirt or something like that. And we show them, a message with red shirt versus white shirt, and we measure how much people like the person, for example. This is not exactly, but you get the idea. So this is the type of research that's being done in this area. And in communication, we do a lot of research like that. Basically, most of the research I know in communication is being done in that little area. And then we write our papers and we say, in conclusion, we found this cool thing, and it should be applicable to interventions in the future. But we never actually go and take it all the way to the intervention. And the problem, as they write in this paper that's going around, is that there is a lot of really cool stuff happening in here. But there's really, oftentimes, people jump directly to the efficacy trial, and it's too early. Or they try to do some pilot studies, and they fail, and so then they abandon rather than refine the treatment. And so I found this kind of map is an extremely useful way of looking where your research currently is, where do you want to take it in the future, and how do you get there. And it's an iterative process. So you go back and forth, and refine and adjust and change things. And the way the phases are defined, similar to, they deliberately use the clinical language because they argue that a lot of clinicians are very familiar with the language of medical clinical trials. And so we should be using the same language in terms of phases, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials in behavioral research. And so the paper actually gives pretty good outline of each of the stages, and it gives direct, specific directions on when do you know how to move between the stages. What kind of key thresholds do you need to clear before you move to the next stage or when you go back? Questions on that? I can go very much in a lot of detail about the actual thing, but basically I think a lot of you might be familiar with the different phases. And so like I know for me, like pilot was, do we need to use control groups in a pilot? And the one thing I learned is actually yes. Or what do you guys? Would you use control groups in pilots? After I said yes.
Is that a trick?
No, are there situations where you wouldn't use a control group in a pilot study?
Yes.
Like when?
I don't know. I can't remember, but I know I've seen studies that pilot studies that don't have control.
Yeah, it could be. So pilots here, they put it kind of the closest to the efficacy trial, but it's really kind of, pilot is often called the proof of concept is also close together with the pilot. So in this stage, you probably don't even need the control group. If you are trying to see whether your treatment can actually produce a change in your critical outcome that you're looking at, and you're just trying to see whether you can move that outcome, you don't need a control group at this point. If with drugs, yes, the first little pilots, they just want to make sure they can find the biologically active amount, and that this biologically active amount, how big can you get it before it becomes too dangerous? When would you want to have a control group in a pilot study?
Well, if you want to see if there's like feasibility and acceptability for the control, and you need to demonstrate it not only for the intervention arm but for the control arm.
Exactly.
Or
So,
if you want to get an effect size estimate for the intervention versus the control, although that's also controversial about.
yeah, we'll get to that.
Scientists
That's one of my
give you good effect size estimates.
That's one of my lessons too. We'll get to that. But yeah, you're exactly right. Sometimes when you are doing the feasibility, so like the pilots, really, you can use them as a feasibility. For your small trial, make sure everything that you said you're going to do in a big trial would work. Can you recruit that many participants in that time frame that you said? Can you keep those participants in study? And a good way, the control group here would be very useful to determine, do you have differential retention in your treatment versus control group? Does your control group make something weird? And so like, it's very useful actually to have control groups in the pilot study. And so this is kind of the big picture, and the paper gives you a lot more information on that. But that was very insightful for me, where I realized like where my research is and how I need to take many steps in order to get to the efficacy track. And this only really focuses on this side, whereas you can also have then stage 4, the effectiveness research or pragmatic trials, and then a lot more on this side. So that's a whole another area where once you establish that your intervention is effective, is better than potential the usual care, how do you then adapt it and implement it? And that's this whole implementation and dissemination research area which goes out here, which I think maybe some of you are already working at, but I know for myself I'm like way far. Wait. Maybe eventually I'll get to the implementation and dissemination. But there are a lot of resources on implementation, dissemination. And actually there's another Summer Institute on implementation and dissemination. So if you're interested in that, you can go there too.
Now, I've sometimes heard efficacy trials, though, as being considered proof of concept trials.
Yes, so as I said, the definitions and the phases, they do differ a little bit. And in some cases, they do put efficacy trial here and effectiveness here and then dissemination here. And so it's like, it does. Okay. Some people refer to it that way. Okay. But I frequently heard efficacy trial is kind of the big phase 3 where you actually have your treatment, your control group, and determine it whether or not your treatment makes the clinically significant difference. But yeah, absolutely, they use all sorts of terminology. All right, so lesson 3. Don't try to do it alone. When being a grad student and then a postdoc, but especially as a grad student, you are taught to do everything. You are the statistician, you are the data entry person, you do everything. When you are running your clinical trials, even at the earlier stages, you need a team. And there are different people, and your teams could be really big or really small. But there are 3 essential sets of skills that you should have on your team. The one is scientific and clinical expertise. And so those are the people that can help you determine what your trial design is, what control group should you use, what is your central clinical question that you're focusing on, and all sorts of questions and answers like that. The next is administrative expertise and support. And in trials, a lot of my studies, I just do them online. It's very simple. You get participants in an online study, you never meet them, they just fill out your quick survey, done. In real life studies, with especially clinical trials, it's oftentimes could be many months that the intervention takes place. And it's many participants who are recruited in person, in hospitals or somewhere else. And so you need a lot of support in terms of administration, how to keep it all running smoothly, and so some people I think here are working in that capacities, and they're very, very important. And lastly, but definitely not least, it's the data management expertise. And data management covers not only statistics, but also your hardware, where do you keep your data on the servers, how do you ensure it's safe, what software do you use, and when this talk was given, the person giving it said, statistician is the most important person on the team. He was a statistician too. But I think those of you who are working as statisticians know that the trialists really appreciate and need that expertise. And one point they made is that once you, as an investigator, as a trialist, you assemble your team, and you can take the team, from trial to trial. And it's great to start early. So even if you're not running your clinical trials now, identify people with whom you can collaborate on the trials when you are ready to do that. On the other hand, he said that people who made careers in filling one of those roles and just fitting in and working with many teams on different trials. And so you become this known specialist in either data management or statistics or whatever, and that could be a whole research career. So don't try to do it alone, even though we're well trained to do it. The next few lessons pertain to the decisions about the trial design. And again, it's a huge area, lots of different issues, but I just focus on a few of them. And again, if you have any questions, just feel free to interrupt. So lesson 4, pick a single outcome. That came as a big surprise for me, because in my studies, we always look at attitudes, intentions, change in perceived harm, all sorts of things. And then many, many more. And then we kind of not pick and choose, but we look at all of them, and some of them are more interesting than the others. But when you do clinical trials, you need to pick a single outcome. And you begin with an important problem. So whatever was your clinically significant question that you identified, should be focused on your outcome. And your primary outcome must provide definitive, unbiased estimate of the effectiveness of an intervention, treatment, or strategy on health. So if you are, for example, if we're looking at smoking cessation, and we use people who are self-report smoking cessation, that might not always be unbiased or definitive, because you don't know if people are lying or not. So you might have to go with the biomarker confirmed outcome in it. And your outcome measure should be persuasive to clinicians and practitioners. So pick something that is of importance to them and something that they would care about. So this is some other information from the slides, and you probably know a lot of them. But basically, your single outcome should be closely tied to your target of intervention and less influenced by factors other than intervention. And you want to expect a robust effect of intervention. So your outcome should be something that is not easily affected by something else, like time, although the control group would take care of that. But pick something that's really what your intervention can affect. And it should have substantial public health significance. It should be clinically meaningful. Could be in terms of reduced events such as death or disease. But in a lot of times when you are doing a study and death and disease happen pretty rarely, you can then go for slightly removed, so-called intermediate outcomes that have been associated with more distal events. So here's an example is like 10% BMI reduction, the body mass index reduction, that's been associated with reduced health risk. And only use one primary. So that was really hard for me to swallow. How can you have just one outcome? Well, luckily, you can have secondary outcomes. And so I was like, okay, I can deal with that. So those are more proximate or more distal to your intervention than the primary. They could be mediators of change or measures that can help explain the null effect. So if your intervention, for example, you're looking at how you actually change body mass index. You're doing an obesity study. One way through which you think your intervention might work is to affect the mindfulness of eating. So people don't just eat too much, they actually are mindful about the amount of food they take. So mindfulness, in this case, would be a more proximate outcome that happens before your final outcome. And it also could be a mediator for change. And I'm sure you all know what mediators are, but for those who don't, mediators is just this variable that's not your primary outcome, but something else, and your intervention affects the mediator, and then it's the mediator that affects the outcome. So in your study, let's say you've developed an intervention to change the mindfulness of eating. That's your mediator. And then you ran a study and you found that you don't have any change in body mass index. Because you had this hypothetical mediator, you measured it, you then can look and see, okay, was it that my intervention did not change the mediator, in which case that was the failure to change the mediator, or another explanation for null effect could be it actually changed the mediator, but the mediator wasn't associated. People ate mindfully, they still ate mindfully a lot. So it could be something like that. So this is lesson 4, pick a single outcome. And again, the single outcome is something that is most critically important in your study. So effect size. Stuart mentioned earlier, can we use the pilot studies to develop effect size? And that I was very familiar with that because that's what you write in grants oftentimes. So you'll see it written in grants saying like, and we're going to do a pilot study and to determine effect size, blah, blah, blah. And the answer is, basically, at least, Tor said it's a controversy. We were, at that institute, we were pretty clearly said that pilot study results should not be used for sample size determination due to inherent imprecision and effect size estimates from small sample size and increased chances of type 1 and type 2 error. So to translate all of that, in case you're not familiar with this language, the reason you need effect size is you need to calculate how many participants you have in a study. You need to do a power analysis. And effect size is kind of how big of a difference you want to create or hope to create in your study. And then you use fancy, or Tor would use fancy statistical analysis to tell you how many participants they need. And what this says is that simply using pilot studies is not going to cut it. And the reason for that is that pilot studies are usually quite small. And when you have small n, you can estimate your effect size. But the confidence interval around that effect size would be pretty big. And so there is a paper, actually, the role and interpretation of pilot studies in clinical research, just a couple pages. And they talk about exactly about that. So another piece of useful reading, you just can look at it and pass it around. And so basically it just says you shouldn't be using effect size from pilot study as the only thing. It's okay to use it in combination with other things, such as look at the literature, look at what is your so-called. What's your minimally clinically important difference? Yes?
Sorry, back to the last the effect size question in the pilot trial. If you have nothing else, what did they say anything about that? Like,
if you, I don't remember exactly if they said you, because I think it's very, very rare that you would be about to do a pilot study or have done a pilot study already on some issue, and there is nothing in the literature or nothing else besides your pilot study. So it's a very rare condition. But, as Tor said, it's a controversy, so there's some other papers where they're like, well, you can use it if there's nothing else, but, back it in with something else. And the more appropriate way to determine what effect size you should be looking at is the minimally clinically important difference. And that should be determined either by the literature or consensus of experts. How big a difference makes clinical significance? Not statistical significance, because you can get statistical significance pretty much any time you have big enough sample size, but a clinical significance. So earlier when they said 10% reduction in BMI, and that's considered clinically significant, because you can actually, if a body mass index drops by 10%, that has actual effects on your health outcomes. So that's considered clinically significant. What percentage of your population dropping down, the drop in morbidity or mortality? How many would quit smoking as a result of your intervention? What proportion is clinically significant? Because you can have, small effect, and you can do something, but is it clinically meaningful? And we use the effect sizes, as I said, to calculate the power and calculate your sample size. And it's quite appropriate, and actually reviewers like it when you, rather than picking a single effect size, you kind of like, well, based on the pilot studies and the literature and the consensus of experts, the effect sizes range from, you can say, something to something. And then you do a range of calculations for your sample size based on the different effect sizes and different power. And then kind of you have the table, and you can see what you can afford with your resources and all of that. All right, lesson 6. What is the appropriate control group? And here the issue is twofold. One has to do with ethics, and the other has to do with the purpose of the trial. And ethics is a very important issue because it's very often, if some therapy intervention already exists that helps people like your population, it's completely unethical to have a control group that is, a control group in its strict sense, it's like a placebo only. And another part has to do with equipoise, and that was a new word I learned. How many of you had heard that word before? All right, about half. Excellent. So, an equipoise means the ethical basis for medical research that involves assigning patients randomly to different treatments in a clinical trial. So that's kind of what the clinical trial is all about. You assign people randomly. But what equipoise really means is that you shouldn't expect one treatment to do better than the other. You should be completely ambivalent. I'm like, Okay? So it's a state of general uncertainty on the part of clinician or investigator regarding the therapeutic merits of each arm in a trial. So you cannot ethically assign people, so it's ethically necessary condition in all cases of clinical research. So much so that if it's disturbed during the course of the trial may need to be terminated, and all subjects previously enrolled offered the superior treatment. So if you as an investigator believe that the treatment you develop is better than the control you have, or treatment as usual, whatever control group you use, you have no ethical basis to assign people to control group. And that just like blew my mind. How? But I know my treatment is better.
You know, that's like null hypothesis testing. We test the null under the assumption that the two arms are equivalent, but the reason why we're doing the work is because we have an implicit belief that the intervention arm is superior to the, or depending on the focus of your trial, not inferior to the control arm.
That's true. Well, the thing here is like you really have to either, well, it kind of contradicts with how I think about research, because I develop my treatment, I think it's actually better, and I need to test it. But the equipoise is actually saying you develop a treatment, but you have no idea if it's better or worse than whatever you're testing it against. And that's why you are testing it. Otherwise, there would be no point of testing. And so the solutions to this is, one is you can have two different people, one big clinician actually dealing with the patient, and the other being the investigator. And as an investigator, I can say, like, oh, it's a better treatment. But as a clinician who actually deals with people, they should be believing that either one is good. You can have a perfectly unbiased investigator, which is hard to come by. Or what is more achievable, you can have the therapeutic uncertainty in the clinical community, which is called the clinical equipoise. So if there's in general lack of consensus, this would be sufficient. And so there's also the difference between community versus individual equipoise. So a clinician may be convinced that treatment A is better than treatment B, but is aware that no consensus exists among clinicians who care for patients. And that lack of agreement is sufficient justification for the trial. And the reason why this is so important, well, first of all, it's ethical, but second, when you're trying to enroll participants in a study and your consent form says, we know that treatment, like chemotherapy, works, but in this study, we want to see if behavioral intervention is as effective. And so participants, when they read that and they get assigned to behavioral intervention, they might not want to stay in the trial because that just doesn't sound right to them. And so it's a big problem when you're trying to recruit, when you try to keep people in the study. And so it's very important to keep that equipoise. So how do you reach the best comparable groups? All right. So how do you choose a comparator group? And notice that it's not a control group, but a comparator. And the difference here is, will become clear in a second. In clinical trials, I think it's this thing is blocking it. So actually, if you could just push the whole computer to the left a little bit. I think that metal shield is preventing it from.
Yeah.
It works? So, in a standard drug trial, it's easy to determine what your comparison group is. Most of the times, it's just the placebo versus the pill, and they're identical except biologically, In the this is I might have to migrate over there. In the behavioral trials, it's much more challenging, and it depends on the purpose of the trial, the purpose of the comparison group, and the purpose of the trial design. And that was a whole lecture on the whole, this is one slide, it's a whole 2-hour lecture. So I'm not going to go in much detail about what the purposes of the trials are, but just to give you an example, is your purpose of the trial kind of to establish in the beginning whether your treatment has an effect because of the treatment as opposed to just simply passage of time. Are you focused on internal validity? In that case, you might want to compare it to control group, which is, the purpose is just to compare it, to control it rather than to compare it. So you want to study a control group that will prevent you from just saying, prevent other people from saying like, oh, your study has an effect simply because you just paid attention to your participants. Or they came to hospital and just being in the hospital is a good thing. Whereas another purpose of the study might be to develop a treatment that is as effective as a currently used treatment, but maybe cheaper or easier to deliver. In that case, you're looking at the non-inferiority trial, and your purpose is really to compare. And in that case, you wouldn't be using a control group or attention-only control group. You would use comparator group that is whatever's the trial, the intervention you compare. So very, in a nutshell, kind of like, there are so many different types of control groups, and they differ in terms of stringency, how hard it is for your intervention to beat the other thing, and also depend on how far in your research program you are. If you're just developing, you might use less stringent control group. If you are looking at intervention that's already been shown to work, now you might want to compare it to an actual active care. And there's lots of stuff in that. And if you're really interested in how to determine which control group to use for which study, I'll be happy to talk to you more about that. So, control groups, equipoise, and all sorts of different controls that should be used. Lesson 7, be honest with participants. That was also a little bit interesting to me, because a lot of times in my studies, we would tell them something. We wouldn't tell them the purpose of the study, because that would be just defeat the whole thing. You tell them in the end, maybe, oh, we tried to measure how you react to this because of blah, blah, blah. But in clinical trials, honesty is the best policy. And the reason for that is you don't want to be so hard selling that then participants get in, but then you would lose a lot of them when the trial starts. And the person giving this presentation was Michaela Kiernan from Stanford, and she does a lot of research on obesity clinical trials, and a lot of her trials are like 7-8 months long. And what they do beforehand, they actually have an orientation, participant orientation, before they sign a consent form, before they commit to participation in the study. But they bring people in, like in a room like that, those who are interested in participating, and PI leads that section, not research assistant or anything. And what they do there is really just explain to participants the whole thing, like what is the study all about, what's expected of them, and introduce this new concept, which is the value of clinical studies like that. Why are they conducting the study? And teach participants, like, what happens when half the participants in the control group drop out? Or some people, when they actually show graphs and the whole thing. And so they're thinking in terms of partnership with participants. And it's complete opposite of the hard sell, just trying to get them in the study. And in the same introduction or orientation session, they use the methods of motivational interviewing and have participants themselves come up with the pros and cons of being in the trial versus not being in the trial. And they actually have a flip chart divided. They have cons and pros of being in the trial or not being in the trial on your own. So, like, these are the people who are women who are trying to lose weight. And then they take a few minutes, working in small groups, and just fill out all of that. And then as a group, they go through and write all this in the board. And they start here and finish here. You don't want to emphasize, like, the pros of being in the trial, but emphasize the cons of not being in the trial and the cons of being in the trial. And that gives participants they come up with their own reasons. And the reasons could be completely different from what researchers might think. But this enables participants to just weigh in and see what are really they committing to. And then they're given time to think about it, talk to their family and friends before committing to the study. But if they do decide to go forward with the study, they're asked to make two commitments. And one is the commitment to self, and the other is commitment to science. And so it's emphasized there. And after they've gone through this orientation session, they already learned about how science works. And so it's emphasized that even if you don't come to studies, to it's a group therapy sessions, whatever. So if you don't come to that, still do our evaluations, because that's very, very important. So I thought that was very interesting on how to increase retention in clinical trials. And Michaela actually measures all of that. So she does within study. And she randomizes people to orientation versus no orientation. So you can actually have those little methodological sub-studies within your study. And it's been shown that type of stuff increases participant retention.
What's her name?
Michaela Kiernan. Lesson 8. There's more than one way to randomize participants. In fact, there's more than 2 or 3. So here are some examples. They're called complete, simple, stratified, permuted blocks, adaptive. And I'll get back to the other one. But the point is that the reason you randomize, what you want to have in the end, is something where it's impossible to predict the next assignment. So if you go this person, this person, that, you can always predict which group the next person goes in, and that might, you might bias the study and assign healthier participants to your treatment protocol. You don't want to have differences between the groups. So if you're doing a coin flip, which is one type of simple randomization, coin flip, by chance alone, you might get tails 5 times in a row, and you end up with 5 more participants in your whatever condition. And if suddenly you have to cut and stop the study, then you're going to have uneven and unbalanced numbers. So you don't want to do that. It should be easy to implement. So if you we went over the different adaptive randomizations designs, and those are really fancy and really cool, but really difficult. And in situations where participants get randomized on the fly, it's you recruit them in clinical setting, it has to be very simple. You pull out whatever the next envelope you randomize. It should be robust against changes in the study. So occasionally, you might have to change something in your protocol, which is not a good thing to do, but sometimes you have to. And if you still have this unbalance in your groups by then you can't just change it right away. And it should also be clearly documented. So with the coin flips, it's not so documented, but if you're doing random numbers, then it would be documented. So going back to all sorts of different types of randomizations, and there's whole chapters in that book. But as a takeaway point, if you are doing randomization, what we've been advised is to use stratified if you think there's some demographic group or some other group that will affect your outcome. If you think your intervention might affect women differently than men, then you should stratify. Meaning you take men and you randomize men, and you take women and randomize women. So you end up with the same number of women in the treatment and the control group. So later on, you don't have all women in one group, and that's what you've explained the finding. So use stratified and use permuted block design. And the permuted block design is basically when you have, let's say you have 4, the block would be number 4, and you would randomize the numbers within. So you do A and B. So let's say your group is A and B, and you go block 1, A, B, B, A. Block 2, randomize, it would be B, B, A, A. And then other, and then you just do it. It's pretty easy. If you do in randomization, look up permuted block design, and that's what the statisticians were saying you should do Lesson 9, don't get carried away with mediators and moderators. I was also probably guilty of many times. And once again, mediator is that variable that your treatment or your intervention will affect, and that it would affect them, like that mindfulness in eating. Moderator is a variable that exists before your treatment, such as gender. Your intervention is not going to affect the moderator, but the intervention might work differently for different groups of moderators. And this moderator, sometimes called like the group analysis or something where you look at how your intervention works differently in different groups. And this was actually a whole big debate in the Institute, because some people were, well, we ran our trial, we didn't find any effect. So what we do now, we do the moderator analysis, and we see if our treatment had different effects in different groups, and boom, we found that in 17 to 25-year-old women, our treatment had an effect. So that's what we published. And others were saying, no, you should never do it. And the thinking here is basically, it's okay to do that as long as you pre-specify this before you do all your data collection. So if at the planning stage you think that there's mediators that you need to look at, like your whole intervention is based around changing a mediator, and then this change the mediator will affect the outcome, then you definitely should be doing mediator analysis. However, if you don't pre-specify that, and you just measure lots of things and then go fishing, that's not a good thing. And the same with moderators. And there was another cool paper by Stuart Pocock called Subgroup Analysis, Covariate Adjustment, and Baseline Comparison in Clinical Trial Reporting, Current Practice and Problems. And really was enlightening for me, because one thing they said is, you know how in studies you look at an experiment and table 1 usually lists all the participant characteristics overall, and then by the condition. And then you see people doing the probability, basically the statistical test to determine whether your assignment to conditions evenly distributed. Were there any differences based on demographics, based on conditions? And what this paper says, it's basically completely useless to do that. Because if you really randomize participants to the different conditions, by chance, you might just end up with more women in treatment conditions than with men. If you think that would be a problem, you should stratify by that. But if you don't think it's a problem, you don't expect the intervention to be different for women and men, you don't need to worry about it. And the p-values in that table don't give you any value. I mean, you're not testing a hypothesis that you randomize perfectly. But you do see this often in the papers where it's like, and our randomization was successful because all our p-values in our chi-square analysis were less than 0.0, I mean, more than 0.0. But apparently, you shouldn't be doing it. So that's pretty useful paper. Another thing with the covariate analysis and all of that is, because I struggle with that a lot, like, do we include covariates in our analysis? Randomization should take care of all of that, so do we need to include them or not? And in this paper they say basically, if your covariate is really strongly associated with your outcome, like the correlation is more than 0.05, then you should include it in covariate analysis, regardless of whether you're randomized perfectly or not. But if it's not strongly related, then it doesn't matter. Even if it's not perfectly randomized, then you don't need to worry. And I thought that was pretty useful, so I'm going to do this with my analysis from the paper that I'm writing right now. So don't get carried away with mediators and moderators. If you pre-plan on doing this, that's fine, as long as you put it in the plan ahead of time. And what is the plan? You'll get there. Oh.
Yeah.
So when you develop your plan, you actually put this plan somewhere, and you register with clinicaltrials.gov, and then later on use the consort guidelines for reporting. How many of you guys have registered, and how many of you wrote consort statements for papers? Okay. Here's an example, a paper that outlines the guidelines for reporting clinical trials. Here's the kind of the checklist items, and I think it's very useful to do that not only when you're already publishing, and because the journal required you to do it. A lot of journals wouldn't publish your paper if you haven't put together the consort guidelines, but at the planning stage, to make sure you cover all your bases, you don't forget anything, and it's very useful to have. And this is an example of the flow chart with how you randomize people to different conditions and how you allocate people or something like that. So notice that, for example, did not receive allocated intervention. Give reasons. Same here, follow-up, close to follow-up. Give reasons. So that's another way of documenting. And then putting your study on clinicaltrials.gov. And if you fund it, if your actual clinical trial funded by NIH, it's required. For smaller trials, for many behavioral trials that's not funded, it's not required, but it's very much encouraged. And the reason for that, we've been told, well, one is that in the past, when those trials are not registered, you see very much selective reporting of the results. And so if you find some significant results and they're good results, you publish it. But if you don't, the results never see the light of day. And so then other people will do the same study and fail again. And so it's just way better for the science to have it. And also, there was examples when a pharma study published, it was more than a 12-month study, but they only published the data from 12 months, because that's at 12 months it showed very beneficial effects of their drugs. But if they look past the 12 months, that's when the drug has actually detrimental effect, but that's never was published. And so to prevent stuff like that, and also to facilitate science, like you can do a lot of meta-analysis, systematic reviews, once you have the complete set of studies. Clinicaltrials.gov are very useful. And it also helps participants and patients to actually go there and find studies. And it's pretty simple to put stuff up there. They say 70% of trials get up there without any corrections, and about 30% need to be corrected by someone. So it's not just you putting stuff out there, it's actually people from the government, clinicaltrials.gov, making sure stuff is correct. It's not peer-reviewed, but it goes through some sort of oversight. All right. Well, that basically concludes my 10 lessons that I learned. And again, with the wealth of experience here and the knowledge, if you have feedback or more thoughts on any of that or questions, I'll be happy to answer.
The pre-planning consort thing, I think, is a really good piece of advice. I've been in some situations with some projects where I came on late and the investigator had to wasn't aware they had to do a consort chart for a journal, and finding that information and kind of patching it after the fact involved a lot of effort. So it's really an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Esther, did you have some papers to learn?
Evaluations.
Oh, yeah, please. So, don't run away.
No.
Yes, did you?
I was going to echo what Tor said. Having missed it the first time, the second time you plan a study, it actually influences the protocol that you write, knowing what consort is going to ask. I'd also say the registration was also required by many journals.
Oh, yeah.
Previously done it, otherwise they won't take it at all.
Yeah, and you should do it beforehand.
Yeah.
When it comes to pre-registration, I'm actually having this discussion with the PI right now. We're doing a study. We're measuring a large number of blood markers that we think are relevant to the intervention we're doing, the outcomes we're interested in. And we're trying to and we've agreed on one that we think is a primary outcome, and that's what we're putting up on clinicaltrials.gov. And we're trying to decide, do we list every other thing we might want to analyze as a potential secondary or exploratory outcome? Or should we keep that fairly lean, but still go ahead and look at those things and report them if they end up being interesting?
So that's that paper was from Popova, kind of mentioned that a little bit. So what their recommendation is that ideally, if you know some of those secondary outcomes are definitely going to be looked at and analyzed, you should put them in. Otherwise, you should specify the criteria of how you're going to select the ones that you are going to consider interesting, such as the ones that have strong association with the outcome, such as whatever, more than 0.05 or something like that. So have a mechanism in place. So rather than you later on come in and just cherry picking the best ones, specify that cherry picking process in the registration.
Great. Yeah, I mean, a lot of these aren't mediators or moderators, rather they're outcomes that are sort of conceptually similar to the main outcome, but also different.
Okay, so in this stage, it seems like when you might not be doing the efficacy trial yet, because you're at this point, you're maybe in the defined stage where you're trying to determine what is your actual main outcome. And so then if you specify that this is like early stage trial, and our goal is to determine what would be our main outcome, then you can list all the things. I think it would be, the more stuff you report, the better, in my opinion, but I might be totally wrong.
I'm inclined to agree.
Yes?
Thanks for the great talk. By the way, is that Prezi?
Yeah.
Is there any chance you can give an example of a study that you've done that kind of like allows you to walk through these lessons and like contextualize these points a little bit more?
Well, I haven't really done any clinical trials, so I am very much in the early stage. As I said, I'm working really in this basic behavioral social science research, so I do a lot of experiments, but my outcomes are all attitudinal, behavioral intentions rather than behavior. And so I don't think I have a single one, but if you look at the first paper where they mentioned that model, they kind of go through all the different stages and using, I think, obesity interventions to kind of give it an example. I mean, again, this is like, I'm pulling this from 2 weeks of training, so it's not a single kind of coherent presentation. It's just like lots of different little lessons. And for me, it's like some things that struck me as the most. So like, unfortunately, I can't like take one study and say this is how it applies. But yeah.
So I found it very interesting. For example, whether you put other covariates in a randomized trial. The way I learned about is that you don't have to do it because the randomization takes care of all of this. So I guess some of the thought has changed over time.
Well, that was just from that one paper where they strongly argued that if your covariate is really strongly related to the outcome, that you should look at it.
And then I have a question. Your steps are getting steeper and steeper. Is this by design?
No, I think it's just by the
Limitation, space limitation?
Yeah, I noticed the last step doesn't even have a lesson on it, so.
Oh, right.
Yeah, no, I think it actually should be getting shallower and shallower as you get more and more experience with that. So.
Yeah.
Other questions, observations, or something where you thought would be that I should have covered and I didn't? Or something you think, if I give this talk again with other lessons, do you think I should include or some more stuff? So like suggestion to give like a coherent, what you said, like an example of the steps would be very useful.
I think that would help a lot because a lot of this for me was like, it was a little abstract, but it was good.
Yeah, no, I think given a specific example would be very useful, and I appreciate that feedback.
I think, and this is kind of a pet mine stuff, but I think it would be useful to have more information on the clinical trials pre-registration. That seems like something that's still taking a lot of people by surprise, that they didn't expect to be important at all and don't know how to do. And also it's something where, as I alluded to, there are sometimes arguments with other investigators about how, oh, this is just going to hurt us because now we can't cherry pick our results or just report whatever looks good. So talking about how to make that work for you, I think, would be helpful.
Yeah, I think the idea behind the pre-registration is not necessarily how it might work for you. I mean, it is, but the thinking more behind it is like it's going to work for the science as a whole, and it might hurt your cherry picking, basically. Yes.
At the end of your Summer Institute, did you have had you begun to prepare a proposal, or did you have any other assignment that you and the other participants had?
We did. So as part of the structure of the Summer Institute, it's a good question. We would have about 3 big lectures, 3 to 4 lectures a day, and then in the afternoon we would work with small groups, and small groups were like 7 people. And we did develop basically a proposal for it. The end result was a presentation, an hour-long presentation covering proposal for randomized behavioral trial. And so they've done it in different ways in the past, and this year they gave us like a set of studies, and we basically had to extend one of the studies. So rather than working on our own or anything like that, it was just we picked, like our group picked on an intervention, kind of mobile media intervention, how to increase medication adherence in adolescents with asthma. And we deliberately picked it up because like nobody in the group was an asthma scholar. Yeah. And so we wanted to pick something where it was like not familiar with us. So that was more of an abstract exercise in that sense, but you still get some really cool practice with them. And I feel like with the skills and knowledge they give here, people just start and run their trial right away. Another thoughts and questions? Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.